father, Nicomachus, was the personal physician to King Amyntas of Macedon, who is the father of King Philip II of Macedon, which means King Amyntas was the grandfather of Alexander the Great. That's going to be important in a minute. His father died when he was very young. He was raised by by family or someone who fostered him. When he was 17 or 18, he studied at Plato's Academy in Athens. And he would remain there for about 20 years until he was 37. He was there during Plato's lifetime too. He actually knew Plato. Shortly after Plato's death, Aristotle left Athens at the request of King Philip II of Macedon to tutor his son Alexander. He went to Philip II of Macedon's court and personally was Alexander's private tutor. Not only that, he also taught two of Alexander's 4 generals. He taught Ptolemy and Cassander as well, and they would be under him. And when Alexander died and his empire was divided, they were two of the ones that his kingdom was divided up among. So Aristotle also founded a school of philosophy in the Lyceum in Athens, and he also established a library for his own personal writings, but on papyrus scrolls, but only a third of that original output survived. Aristotle is considered by many to be the father of numerous topics and subjects, especially the natural sciences. He wrote on philosophy, logic, political science, rhetoric, realism, individualism, psychology, literary and dramatic criticism. He's the father of literary and dramatic criticism. The scientific method. He had a very rudimentary understanding of the scientific method. Biology, natural law, zoology, embryology, meteorology. He was the father of a lot of these things. He was a very, very, very smart man. Wish I knew half of what he knew. Aristotle, in terms of his philosophical beliefs, among other things, is known for believing in teleology, which basically goes back to telos. Aristotle believed that everything, living, non-living, animate, inanimate, had an ultimate purpose, goal, or end. He believed, so for example, he believed the telos of warfare is victory. The telos of business is the creation of wealth. The telos of a blacksmith is the production of a tool or weapon. The telos of a soldier is to use a sword or another weapon to incapacitate or kill an enemy. He also believed that the telos of each of these parts ultimately served the greater good or the greater telos of a ruler or a kingdom who must oversee the direction and well-being of a state. So kind of like you have each little member, you have each little organ that has its own function, it serves its own purpose, but then it ultimately comes back to the service of a higher good too. He believed that telos is the supreme end of man's endeavors. He believed, now he didn't take it to the spiritual or theological extent that we do, and obviously Paul did, but he did believe that the telos for humanity is based on our uniquely human capacity for rational thought. He thought it was about knowledge, wisdom, learning, knowing more, and how that separated man from everybody else. I think it's interesting. I think it's funny when I read that, how well that you see that mapped out in 1 Corinthians. I mean, I don't know that I would have to know the Greek of that passage. I don't think Paul uses the actual Greek word telos in any of that, but that is a perfect example of telos and how telos operates. And I think it's possible that as part of Paul's Greek education, he understood that. I think it's also interesting that he used that to explain to Corinthians, to people who were Greek, and I think maybe they understood that because they would have been familiar with the idea of telos and the idea of there being an ultimate purpose, how you have your eyes and you have your ears and you have your feet and you have your hands, and each one has a different function and each one serves its own purpose, but yet that purpose is ultimately directed towards serving the greater good of the body. And I think that is, I see telos in that. I see that, even if nobody else does. I see that. And I think it's interesting that of all the things he could have used to explain this idea about diversity and unity in Christ and those two coming together, he chose an idea that was rooted and grounded in Greek philosophy that the Corinthians would definitely have been aware of, because Corinth is not that far in proximity from Athens. I mean, I was listening to Dr. J. Vernon McGee this morning, and I mean, he said when he was in Athens, he took a bus ride in a day from Athens down to Corinth. So, I mean, by bus, it's not that far. On foot, it's probably a different story. But they would have been familiar with that. And I think maybe in their Greek minds, in these Corinthians, their Greek minds, they would have understood exactly what he was talking about. Because they would have understood Aristotle, and they would have understood the ideology of telos. And I think that's how, and I think that showcases the true brilliance and genius of this man. How he was able to take ideas and concepts. I don't know for certain that he did that, but everything in my spirit and everything I know about Greek culture, which is not much compared to what other people know, I believe that's exactly what he was doing. And I think he was definitely smart enough and intellectual enough and capable enough that he could definitely take Greek philosophy, what he had learned from his education, and use that as a selling point to get people to understand what it was to function as members and believers in the body of Christ. Because this is something they would have understood. The Corinthians were more sophisticated than some of the other. This is a more sophisticated crowd than some of the other audiences for his other epistles. I mean, I think they understood these things. I don't know that he could have said this to the Galatians, maybe. And they would have probably understood it the same way, because they were a little bit further out. So that's just the genius. That is an example of God taking everything about a person, the good, the bad, the ugly, and using it for his purposes. He used this idea that's rooted in Greek philosophy to make a point for his own purpose. Which is a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about now. Let me see how much time I have. Good. Yes, I'm doing so good. Okay, so now we're going to talk about why Greece. Why Greece? Why is Greece so special? Why not Rome? Why wasn't the original language of the Bible Latin? Why was it Greek? Why not ancient Persian or Farsi or ancient Babylonian? What makes Greece so special? Well, I am so glad. If you're thinking that, I am so glad you asked that, because I'm going to answer that for you. So now we're going to go back into the Old Testament a little bit. We're not going to read all of this. This is just going to be a very quick paraphrase, but this is interesting. In the book of Esther, when it opens up in chapter 1, we're in the court of Ahasuerus, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, whatever you want to call him, Xerxes the First, in secular history. We're in his court in Persia, in Susa, and he's hosting a banquet. We're all familiar with that. His empire stretched from Ethiopia to India. He had 127 provinces. He had all of the potentates and the magistrates and whoever ate at this banqueting, and they all ate, trust me, and drank. They truly lived, eat, drink, and be merry at this banquet for 6 months. And this is when he gets really, really drunk. He's feeling his wine. He's probably been listening to a few rounds of Margaritaville or Whiskey River, and is definitely feeling it. And he wants to bring in Queen Vashti because he showed off everything that's great about his empire. He showed them everything else. He's dazzled them with the opulence and the beauty and the splendor of just this room where the feast is. Now he wants to show them his wife. Well, Persian law was funny. The Persians were very modest. And it wasn't really appropriate or proper under Persian etiquette for the women, the wives, the queens, the respectable women to be present in this feast. Now, other women were there, but they weren't wives or anyone of station. Let's just say that and leave it there. And she refuses. She's a woman of nobility. She's got her pride. Just because she's his queen, she's not going to go just because he says, I need you to come. She refuses. And then, of course, we know what happens. There's a meeting after that. He gets mad. I think it's funny. He's so drunk and probably is feeling everything. But he remembers that. He's not so far gone, he doesn't remember that she said no to him. And he has, and like the next day, they have to have a council and meet on that, and they decide to put away Vashti. And then once they do that, they send letters to all of the provinces to let everybody know that she's been set aside, and that all women will give honor to their husbands, from the great to the insignificant. The reason why he's hosting this banquet in the first place is because he is getting ready to mount an invasion and try to invade Greece. He was not the first Persian emperor to do that. His father, Darius I, had tried to make a campaign to go into Greece, and it failed miserably. The Persian Empire reached its zenith and its height. These were the glory days of the Persian Empire under Xerxes. And he wanted to go in and do that. I'm sure he wanted to do that as a ruler and probably also as a son. He wanted to make good his father. Wanted to make Daddy proud. Even if Daddy was dead, but he still wanted to do that. To honor his father and also to make himself look good. Because if he could do that, he's golden. And then, so you have this period of time between chapters 1 and 2 in Esther, when after the banquet ends, he goes off to Greece. Is kind of successful at first, but then two things happen. First, he meets the Spartans at the pass of Thermopylae, the Battle of Thermopylae, and the Spartans don't have the numbers, they don't have the quantity, but they do have the quality. And they basically, it's utter defeat. They really hit him with a hard blow. Then, after that, when he tries to retreat, he goes into another part of Greece, and you have the naval battle of Salamis, and that destroys most of the Persian Empire's fleet. Most of their ships are utterly destroyed in that. And he is so mad that, according to secular history, he takes a leather belt and starts to beat the ocean in a fit of rage because he's lost all of his ships and he has to return. Which basically ends his campaign into Greece. He leaves a general, but within 2 years after him leaving, the general returns. He comes back. There's no headway there. Chapter 2 opens, it says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, had subsided, he remembered Vashti. Now, that's interesting, after these things. That does mean after what happened with the banquet, but it also, a lot of Bible scholars and expositors have said that in the gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2, that's when the whole campaign with Greece came into. Probably not too long after the banquet, he left. So he didn't really care that Vashti was gone. He was leaving. He was going to Greece. He was going to defeat the Greeks. When he came back defeated. His pride had been wounded. His pride had been crushed, and he remembered Vashti. And that's how you get into Esther. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, what does this have to do with Greece? My point is this. If he had been successful in that campaign, that could have changed the direction of world history. Not just secular history, but sacred history too. Because if he had been truly successful, it's possible that the Greek language might have been assimilated into Persian. A lot of the philosophy, a lot of the ideology would not have flourished. The language could possibly have been altered forever, and not in a good way. The language of the New Testament is Greek. With the exception of Matthew, every book in the New Testament, from Mark to Revelation, is Greek. The Greek language was part of God's design to take the gospel to the Gentiles. So, keeping the Greek culture with the Greek language intact was crucial. Also, had he gone into Greece and been successful, he might have thought, well, I've got Greece, why not keep on going? It's possible he could have gone on into Europe, maybe gone into Italy, maybe marched up and taken over Rome. Now, what does that have to do anything? Well, when Jesus was born, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was ruling over the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the fact that Paul was born in a city-state, in a place in Tarsus where he was born with Roman citizenship outside of Rome, was a huge thing of importance, as we've seen with Myra and Jeffrey and others, and me too. We've all pointed to places in Acts where that Roman citizenship is his trump card. It's basically his monopoly, get out of jail free card. Because when he throws that down, they can't touch it. They can't do anything. Also, if you think about it, the birth of Jesus came at a time when the Roman Empire was needing taxes. So Augustus issued a decree for the entire Roman world at that time that they should all go. And in Israel, that meant everybody went back to the place where their family was born, their family heritage. Which is why Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem. Isn't it interesting how the whims and the designs and the egos of men can be completely manipulated for God's purposes and what he needs to have happen? There's another place where we see that too. The way that God achieves this is just fascinating. Now, we're going to talk about one of my favorite people who's secular, but he's still a really cool person. We're going to talk about Alexander the Great. You're wondering, what does that have to do with anything? It has a lot to do with it, because Alexander the Great, first of all, only lived 32 years. After his father was assassinated and he became king of Macedonia, when he was 20, he started a campaign to basically rule the world. His idea was to take over and rule over the entire world. And the center of his world was a world that was dominated by Greece, by Greek culture. He wanted to spread the Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, everything that was Greek. He wanted the world to be Greek. And this is a man who did in 12 years what Julius Caesar couldn't do in his lifetime. Nor could Sulla, nor could any of the other great generals. He was never defeated in battle. And at the time of his death, he ruled an empire from Greece that extended from Greece to the northwest tip of India. And he did it in 12 years. He took over the Mediterranean, so that by the time you get to Jesus' birth, Greek is one of the predominant languages of the Mediterranean world. most people understood Greek and could speak Greek. Even if it was just rudimentary, even if it was very basic. Greek was the language. And let's not forget, when Jesus was crucified, the accusation board that was at the top of his cross was written in Latin, it was written in Hebrew, and it was written in Greek. So without this man, Alexander the Great, coming into the scene and believing that he's going to take Greek to the world, and he's going to make the entire world Greek, how else is the language going to get to where it needs to get? How else are you going to penetrate a culture that's Hebrew, that speaks one language? How else are you going to do that? Again, this is so cool. I mean, to me, I envision this is almost like a chess. This is almost like a chess game for God. He's like, oh, okay, I'm going to move Alexander here. Knights, I don't know, whatever move. But it's like these chess moves.
Yeah.
And it's world history. And his chessboard is world history. And I'm not going to read every single passage, but I mean, in Daniel, there are 4 places in Daniel where it shows you the nations. It begins with Babylon. It begins with Nebuchadnezzar. It goes through the Persians. Then the Greeks, a good 200 years before Alexander is ever entered onto the scene. So 200 years before Greece, Daniel's writing about what's going to happen. And in one of the passages, let me go there. Let's go to one of them. Because I know I don't want this to be an all-day thing. Even though I could be happy and it be all day. I could sit here till tomorrow and be okay and be happy, but I know everybody else couldn't. So that's okay. Let's see, let me find it. Okay, that's not the one. That's not the one. Okay, let me see if this is the one. This is the one. No, that's not the one. 7-6, I bet it's that one. This is the one. Daniel, you don't have to go there, but if you want to go there, you can. Daniel 7:6. After this, I kept looking, and behold, another one, the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great. This is the Amplified. Like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings like those of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, Alexander's generals and his successors, and power to rule over it. Daniel is describing perfectly 200 years before it happens what it's going to look like, because a leopard is one of the fastest animals on the earth. A lot of modern military historians they put a lot of emphasis on Germany utilizing the Blitzkrieg, which is lightning fast warfare. Hitler utilized it, but I don't think he utilized it to the same extent that Alexander the Great did, and I don't think he had the same measure of success. Because Alexander the Great started when he was 20 and was dead by the time he was 32. And in that 12-year period of time, he was never defeated in battle, and he managed to go from Greece to India and conquer everything in between. That is the Blitzkrieg on steroids. It makes mention of the fact that he had on its back 4 wings. Again, the leopard's already fast anyway, but it's got wings, which means it's going to move even faster. He's got these 4 generals. And these 4 generals, the relationship between he and these generals, they're like brothers. He trusts them implicitly. He grew up with 2 of them. He grew up with Ptolemy and he grew up with Cassander. And then also there was Antigonus and Seleucus. And they've got wings like those of a bird, and they also had 4 heads. They were all in agreement. The only thing is, when Alexander the Great died, he had no children. He was married 3 times, never had any kids. So they're the ones that inherited his empire, and they parceled it off. And But by him doing that, that brought the Greek language to the Mediterranean world. By the time you get to the times of Paul, and I did some research on this, in the Roman Empire, the official language of the empire was Latin. But I think the official language of the empire was really Greek. Because not everybody spoke Latin. Only magistrates, only maybe higher up soldiers who had the benefit of an education could speak or understand Latin. But most of the people, especially from Asia Minor on, could speak Greek. And they could understand Greek. And I think in a lot of ways, Greek, where there wasn't that much understanding with Latin, they used a lot of Greek. I don't really have enough learning or enough of a degree to back that up, but that's what I think. And this is my teaching, so that's what I think. And I'm owning it. The Greek language is a very versatile language. I have an uncle who studied at Dallas Baptist University and Southwestern University in Texas. He loves Greek. He will sit. You give him you've got 3 hours of your time, and he'll tell you all you need to know about the Greek language and how rich it is, and how vital it is, and what a versatile language it is. I want to conclude with this, because this is the last component of Greek culture. This is the most important component of Greek culture, the language. And I don't think you really see that versatility, that depth of meaning with Greek. I don't think there's another passage, for my money, that demonstrates this better than this one. This is a familiar passage. This is when, in John 21, after Jesus he's been raised from the dead, and he goes to the Sea of Tiberias or Galilee, and he has breakfast on the shore with his disciples. And then he and Peter have a little meeting. And I have to admit, I'm taking this shamelessly from Dr. J. Vernon McGee, because he points this out in his Through the Bible study of this. But when he explained this, it's fascinating to me. So in John 21, verses 15 to 19, we have this very familiar discussion between Jesus and Peter. And in English, the way it's translated, I can't think of a better word to use than this, and I don't mean this just impotent in a lot of ways. It doesn't really express the full depth or the richness of what's taking place in that dialogue. But when you understand what the Greek is saying, you really see something there that's not there on the page. So I want to read these verses, 15 to 19. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these others do?" With total commitment and devotion, he said to him, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you with a deep personal affection as a close friend." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Again, he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" With total commitment and devotion. He said to him, "Yes, Lord. You know that I love you with a deep personal affection as a close friend." Jesus said to him, "Shepherd my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me with a deep personal affection for me as for a close friend?" Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time. He said, "Do you really love me with a deep personal affection as for a close friend?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you with a deep personal affection as for a close friend." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." In most English translations, it doesn't make that distinction. It just says love. Jesus says, "Simon, do you love me?" Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And it goes on and on and on. And it's like, okay, what are you saying? What's going on there? Let's break down the Greek. When Jesus, and I've not studied Greek, but like I said, I borrowed shamelessly from Dr. J. Vernon McGee, who studied classical Greek and Koine Greek. I just want to point that out, which are two very different animals. The love that Jesus is talking about is agape. which is the highest type of love in Greek. It's a sacrificial, godlike love that loves only to serve and to sacrifice. That's why every other place in Greek literature and culture, you never see that word used except for in the New Testament. That's the only place, any writings in Greek, where you'll ever see that word. The word that Peter is using is philos, which means a deep, like a brotherly affection, an affection between siblings, an affection for a close friend. It's not the same thing. So let's go back again. In verse 15, when Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you agapeo me? Peter is saying, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Peter's learned something. See, that we see, when you understand that, we understand how far Peter's come in those few days between the night that Jesus was arrested and now. Because before, he said, oh, I agapeo you. I agapeo you, Lord. Yes, I do. But Peter's different now, right? He doesn't say that. He says, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Jesus pushes the point again. He says to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you agapeo me? Simon says, yes, Lord, you know I phileo you. This is where you see the heart of Jesus really come through. The third time, Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, do you phileo me? Peter's grieved. He's answered him twice. He's probably upset too that he can't say agapeo, because I'd say there's a part of Peter that is, everything in him wants to say, I agapeo you, but he knows he can't. Because he's different. Because he denied it. And Jesus asks him a second time, do you phileo me? And Peter says, yes.
Do you phileo or do you agape?
Do you phileo me? No, Jesus says phileo. In the original Greek, and Dr. J. Vernon McGee breaks it down, Jesus, in the original Greek of that passage, the third time he says phileo.
Really? Okay.
Yes. That's what I'm talking about. You see this man, our Savior, our Lord, come down to Peter's level. This is Jesus meeting Peter truly where Peter is at this time. This is him taking a step down and saying, do you phileo me? And I think in seeing it that way, the first time I heard Dr. J. Vernon McGee say that, I wept. Because it was there's so much there.
Yeah.
There's so much love there, and that shows how tender and how beautiful and how sweet